Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of No One's a Critic. I'm Kino, joined as always by Mac. How you doing this week, Mac?
I'm lovely. I started my new series. I'm still working on the Barry video. I found that Barry is a lot more. It's interesting when we've talked about this, and I'm sure you have experienced this, where I did my video on Better Call Saul, and I love that show, and it's excellent. There's so much to talk about. However, there is something to be said about certain shows. The ones that come to mind are like The Leftovers, um, The Shield is one, uh, and now Barry, where there are shows that they are flawed. Um, However, it's almost more interesting to discuss them because it's almost cool to see shows where their reach exceeds their grasp, and to discuss that. Where not to say that like other shows, again, Better Call Saul is great, but Breaking Bad, all these great shows. However, it is almost um, interesting to see a show where it's imperfect, but only because it tried to do something and explore things that were like so beyond.
That's what I think
Yeah.
about. I just did a video on Carnival.
Hmm.
And I was telling you about it. It's super fucking weird. It's like HBO's Twin Peaks, and it's a fascinating show because of how batshit crazy it was. And in retrospect, in looking at the creator's plan for the series, it was never going to materialize. Like it was way too ambitious, way too broad and sweeping in scale to ever play out where it wouldn't get canceled. And I faulted the show for that in some ways, to be like, it ends on this cliffhanger that will never be resolved. Like they will never do a follow-up movie to Carnival 10 years later or whatever, because it's been like 20 years and a lot of the cast are dead now. But it is very interesting that background stuff, and it's fascinating to see into the mind of madness, almost, of like what these shows wanted to be versus what actually translates to on the screen. I think it is a very interesting topic, and it makes for some great videos. Like, I mean, you did uh True Detective season 2, very similar to that, you know, tried to be ambitious but ultimately kind of didn't really pan out.
But on the other hand, well, I would say, yeah, True Detective, I think, kind of falls maybe on like the lower end of that, but something like The Leftovers or Carnival or Barry, now that I'm just talking about it, it is interesting because, granted, I feel, I mean, well, I execution is something that obviously is, that's if we're talking about writing, that execution is everything. However, as I've kind of explored more shows and talked about more stuff, I do come to appreciate um, when filmmakers or storytellers are trying things that, even if they don't execute it properly or like execute it as well as they can, but the idea is like just too big to almost fit into like a single idea. Um, I almost prefer that more because it's like, these are people who are really trying to push the envelope um, in very very big ways. Whereas, I've talked about this before, where um, as much as, again, I'm not like doing this just to purposely like put it down, but like as much as I liked Breaking Bad while I was watching it, the more and more time passes and the more media I explore, as good as the execution was, I think we've talked about this. As good as the execution was, um, the more and more I sit with it, the more I'm just kind of like not unimpressed. I'm more just sort of like, okay, yeah, but like it was good. It was very well executed, but all the themes and everything in the show was just like it. There's so many other shows that just blow it out of the water. Even if those shows didn't um, land on their feet as well as Breaking Bad did, even though I don't really think so. Um, it's I almost appreciate them more for that reason. Even Better Call Saul to some extent.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I could totally get that point of view. I think a lot of people say that about Breaking Bad, and I agree to a certain extent, but I think people do forget that, like, Breaking Bad was pretty early in doing a lot of this stuff. Like, a lot of these other shows, I mean, obviously there were other shows that came out before Breaking Bad, like The Sopranos, The Wire, Mad Men, a little bit before Breaking Bad. They were kind of concurrent, but Breaking Bad was very early to the game with a lot of this stuff. So I think when people kind of I agree with you. I agree. A lot of people find Breaking Bad a lot more simplistic
Was it
compared
though?
to some of this other stuff. But I do think they were not the earliest, but they were part of the early wave of like this type of groundbreaking television. And I think you got to give it some credit for that. I'm not saying it was the very first one to ever do stuff like that. It definitely refined what a lot of other shows like The Sopranos did into a much more streamlined version. Um, but I don't know. I really do appreciate Breaking Bad. I think it is really up there for me with the great television shows.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree. Especially like now that I keep watching, like even putting aside like the major ones like The Sopranos and The Wire, even or even Mad Men. Um, now that I'm going through like older shows, you see something like The Shield or Twin Peaks, or even it sounds weird, but even shows that I'm looking back on, things like 24. Because one thing that Breaking Bad was really sort of that drove Breaking Bad was this like the breakneck intensity. In contrast to something like The Sopranos or The Wire or Mad Men, Breaking Bad was like you put your foot down the gas pedal and it just goes. Particularly once we get into like season 3 and 4, like that's just like a sprint to the finish. And again, execution wise, it's incredibly well done. However, then I look back at other shows, even like something like 24, where that was like, did it land on its feet every time? Absolutely not. That show had a lot of problems. But at the same time, it's just like when I look at that, I'm like, oh wow, this is a show that just kind of, again, every time I look back on Breaking Bad, I almost kind of like, as much of all the stuff that it did well, I sometimes not even shows since, but even shows previous did it so much better. Where I almost kind of question. I will agree that I think it was very important for um particularly like network television kind of getting its due. Like this would sort of prove, granted, I would say The Shield is really a show that should have been kind of crowned that crown, or that title. Um, but I don't know. I just kind of look back on it like, and I'm just kind of meh.
Yeah, but you could say the same thing about a lot of stuff. You could say the same thing about The Sopranos, like, right? I mean, I Claudius came out in the '60s, and it obviously was a huge inspiration for The Sopranos, and it had a lot of those same kind of dramatic beats to it. Where I think that, like, again, I'm not disagreeing with you per se. I just think that, like, I've noticed this about, because we live in this world of like critically acclaimed television of people putting Breaking Bad down, and I agree to an extent. Like it's not the same at the same level as some of these other shows, but I think honestly that perfect execution, I really appreciate that, and I almost disagree. I mean, I agree with you in the extent you were saying about like you can appreciate the ambition behind a lot of this other stuff, but for me, I would prefer something perfectly executed, even if it stays within its bounds. And I think honestly, Breaking Bad like does push the boundaries to an extent with some things. Like, people say it's like this really fast paced thing. It is, but it's also very slow at moments too. Like there is a lot of, you know, there's a lot of cinematic work in the show. Again, can you say that like other shows did, their cinematography better? Sure. But I mean, Breaking Bad is very stylized. It had a lot of slow, character moments that I thought were great in it too. I'm not ready to write off Breaking Bad as like network schlock the way that a lot of people are. A lot of people are ready to put down Breaking Bad as like, yeah, it's like 24 or Dexter or any of these other shows that were just like, mass media, pulp basically. And I'm like, no, there's a lot of artistry to Breaking Bad that I really appreciate still.
Yeah, I wouldn't throw it down that far. I wouldn't say it's shock. Although, even something like I will say, even people who say that about stuff like 24, I almost think it's the opposite, where I think they're almost putting it down a little bit too much. Dexter, granted, for like its later seasons, absolutely. But even something like 24, where you're kind of like, you know, was it absolutely shocky? Absolutely. But considering this was on like a major, you know, network television, this was like kind of holy shit. Like this was, but particularly like when it aired at what, a couple years, it aired in 2004. So what, 3 years after 9/11? That's like, wow. It's not so much that I don't think it's like way down, like schlock. However, it does bug me not only when people crown Breaking Bad as like the top show, but sometimes now I'm getting to the point where like when they even sort of like rank it alongside some of the other shows. Again, not to say it's like way down, but even sometimes when I look and it's like compared to like Sopranos and The Wire and The Leftovers and The Shield, or even Better Call Saul, I'm like, yeah, like, it almost kind of feels like if I were doing like a tier list and like all these shows were like S or A, Breaking Bad's kind of like a, well, maybe B. It's, I don't know. Yeah, that's, it's, I might have to do like I might have to do like a full ass huge retrospective on it. I think the big one for me, particularly, I mean, granted, like I think I'm in the minority when it comes to the final season and ending. I think I'm sort of a, you know, a lot of people don't agree with me on that. I think that's kind of where I think it falters in terms of execution. But even things like, you know, the secondary characters, I felt like weren't very, you know, the subplots, especially compared to like Better Call Saul in many ways is like sort of like broken Breaking Bad for me because
That's
uh,
again, that's I mean, that's totally fair. I mean, you're talking to the guy who really dislikes Better Call Saul's later half in a
mhm.
lot of ways, in a lot of very fundamental ways for me. And that's what I'm saying. I do agree with you to the extent that like I think Better Call Saul was more ambitious in terms of like a lot of its character work and is not in not being as action packed and stuff like that. However, when we get to the later half of Better Call Saul, then I see the problems you have with Breaking Bad. I see those in Better Call Saul, and that kind of sours it for me. And it goes against what you were saying before about like I can totally get how you could appreciate Better Call Saul more for what it tried to do, but for me, it didn't land that as much in the later half. It got the later half of the show is very distracted for me, in making it about like the cartel storyline and all this stuff like that. And so I can appreciate Breaking Bad's like for me very very flawless execution of a lot of its ideas. I agree with you to an extent that like I think the finale has one major flaw which we've talked about before. It's the I think it doesn't punish Walt enough. It does to an extent with his family, but for like the Gretchen and Elliot stuff, he doesn't like really get called out for his bullshit at all in regards to that aspect of it. So I agree with you. It has its flaws, but yeah, we can agree to disagree about this kind of stuff.
Give me like a couple years and check back at me. I'll think that Breaking Bad's total normie shit. And anyway, I do kind of think it is, anyways.
You're not wrong, but I don't know. It's like people kind of have this snobbish attitude of like the same thing like the Dark Knight, right? I get how it's kind of annoying how everyone was like, "The Dark Knight's the greatest film ever. The Dark Knight's the greatest film ever." I understand it can be annoying to hear that, and you naturally want to push back against that. But The Dark Knight is still a very good film, even if you don't like how it was adopted by the public as like the greatest film ever, or you don't like the effect it had on the movie industry, how everything after that had to be copying The Dark Knight. I think that's a fair belief, but I feel like people kind of put that film down at times too. And I'm like, no, it's still a very good film. Maybe it doesn't deserve all the accolades it got, but it was funny. You brought up uh, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and that's kind of going. I saw that going on Twitter where people were like, it got so much hype that people were like, "No, this movie's shit. Like it's Rick and Morty bullshit." And I'm like, "No,
I
you're
don't.
you're you're wrong about that. Like, it's not as perfect as people make it out to be, but it's not garbage either."
Well, that's what's kind of bugs me out, where it's like people will do that. Well, they're like they go from one extreme to the other. It's like it's either like a masterpiece or it's schlock. It's like, well, hang on, that's why are we? What are we doing? Like again, they're tier lists, guys. We don't have to. It's like, you know, break if Sopranos and, you know, The Wire or S tier, Breaking Bad I think is maybe B tier for me nowadays. Um, but it's not, it's not like D tier, it's not F tier, but it's, for some people, it feels like it's one or the other. It's like, I almost want to go to their letterboxd and everything they rate is like 1 or 5 stars. And I'm like, holy shit, guys, what are we
No,
doing
come
here?
on here. That kind of brings us to the topic of what we're going to talk about today, which is I wanted to ask you if, in the course of doing research, either on your own for fun or for a video that you're doing, has the research into the show ever changed your opinion about it, show or movie? Because the idea for this came, I'm doing a retrospective on Oz, the first real HBO show. There were shows before Oz. HBO even had a prison drama before Oz. It was called Maximum Security. No one has ever seen it. Don't pretend like you watched it. It was from the 80s. But or maybe late 80s, early 90s. But I had seen Oz a long time ago. It was actually the first HBO show I ever watched. And I had this idea in my head about what the show was. Like, in many ways, it's a very schlocky show, just like we were talking about. A lot of very weird elements to the show, a lot of plot lines that don't go anywhere, a lot of characters that are not fully developed. And, when I was coming up with the idea for the video, like just kind of coming up with an outline, I thought to myself, like, okay, I'm going to give this show credit for being the first HBO show, but I'm going to point out a lot of the flaws in the storytelling. However, in doing research for the video, I came across this article that said that, like, it Oz shouldn't be interpreted as like a realistic drama the way The Wire is to the drug trade. It
Mhm.
should be interpreted as like more like experimental theater. Like Tom Fontana was trying to do like this very theatrical presentation of prison, and it wasn't meant to be taken so seriously. And when I watched the show again from that lens, I was like, "Oh my god, you're right." Like, this is like, I can see where he's coming from here. Like, the whole hill, Augustus Hill as the narrator is like the Greek chorus, and like it all connected for me, and I had and a much greater appreciation than I already did for the show. Anyway, that was a long story, but I was just gonna ask if like you'd had any kind of like similar experiences for the stuff you cover.
I have, or to your point about the show, that, I mean, you did bring it up, and you kind of mentioned the Dark Knight and stuff like that. I will say that I think that there is something to be said about, as much as I do appreciate, like, sort of like, I'm personally no stranger to it. More hyper realistic, not hyper realistic, sort of like hypercritical, beat by beat, um, film analysis when we're talking about like consistency. Um, However, it does, like, what I mean by that is, like, if I'm watching a show where a character does something completely out of character or something like completely ridiculous where like you can't even believe it, like, okay, we can call that out. But then it gets to a point where, you know, if you're criticizing Oz, or a show like The Shield or The Sopranos because it's like not 100% accurate to, whatever the certain culture or whatever the certain, you know subset they're dealing with, the police or prison. um I don't know, it gets to the point where I think you're almost like missing the point, or like you're almost sort of like being obtuse in a bad faith way, where you're like, because like you have to, who was I talking to the other day? We were talking about Trap, M. Night Shyamalan's new film, where it's very, it got a lot of polarizing reviews. However, if you watch the film, it's very supposed to be like, it's very evidently tongue in cheek. Um, so I think you have to take that with a grain of salt. You have to kind of take that into the film. If you look at it as just like a straight thriller, then yeah, it's not going to hold up at all. But when you look at it as sort of like a tongue in cheek, schlocky type, then okay, it's different. So yeah, sorry, I'll get to mine, but just I understand what you mean about like, um, you kind of have to view the show on the playing field of what the director or the creators are trying to do, and judge it accordingly, instead of, well, why didn't they do this, or I wish it would have been this. And it's like, well, that's not really how it works. So sorry. So the two examples, I'll be quick with them because I did a whole video on one. The two examples that I have where I sort of research has kind of changed my opinion on something of a film. Well, one was the film Cruising, William Friedkin's film about Al Pacino. He plays a cop who goes undercover into the gay subculture of New York. Um, Now, I did a whole video on it discussing, the controversy and the gay community and how they were against the film. And my general feeling of the film was sort of, at in a time when like sort of like this was such a huge, all this stuff was happening in the gay community. The fact that this film just kind of uses it as like a background for like a B tier thriller, I don't really like. I kind of feel a little bit iffy on that. However, that was sort of how I felt of it while I was watching it. Um, However, the big change for me came was when. So, have you ever seen the film Cruising?
Now I saw your video on it, but I never watched the film.
So, I kind of go into it during the plot section. It's notoriously incoherent, where like the plot doesn't really make all that much sense. And however, when I brought this up, a lot of people defended it by saying, "Well, no, man, it's purposely like this. It's like Friedkin's trying to make a point." And then I would retort to them, it's like, "Well, no, because I sifted through a lot of research and a lot of videos and a lot of commentary on it. I just don't think Friedkin knew what the fuck he was doing. Like it was one of those things where it was like what a lot of people, what people attribute to, artistic merit or sort of like, uh, artistic courage was actually just kind of like, uh, he's probably doing a lot of cocaine and he probably was just throwing shit in there. Which on one hand, I'm like kind of going back to what I was saying about like, trying something new. That's all well and fine. I think, or if you're trying to make a point and you miss, that's fine. But particularly after reading a lot up on it, I kind of realized that it was so notorious that Al Pacino and him, I mentioned it in the video, they had a decades long not rivalry, but like feud. Like they don't like each other like at all because Al Pacino basically was like, at some point, he realized Freakin had no idea what the fuck he was doing, particularly with the ending that I go into, the very notorious ending, where it wasn't like ooh, it's trying to say something. But it was like no, I don't really think he knew what the fuck he was doing.
I think
Um,
that a lot of stuff that we and apologize if you hear my dog running around the background, but I think a lot of the stuff that we attribute to artistic intent, if you actually dig into it, a lot of it's just either accidental or the result of circumstances. And, a lot of directors will talk about that. They'll talk about how, I mean, the great example, right, of Jaws, the fact that you don't see the shark was a technical limitation. They couldn't get the damn thing to work. And,
mhm.
a great director can make that work. And I think that's, Spielberg deserves a lot of credit for making it work even better because of that. Or The Godfather, right? The fact that you don't see Marlon Brando at the end, like he just didn't show up. But a great director can make it work even better despite those limitations. But I think that we do a lot of people ascribe intent to stuff that's not really there. I even talk about that in my Oz retrospective that's going to come out pretty soon here. But um, I think that even though I give it the credit for that revelation I had about the show, I also talk about the fact that Tom Fontana wrote every episode of Oz himself.
Damn.
Some of the episode 56 episodes, some of them he had a co-writer, but he wrote the vast majority of the scripts. I've never seen that before in my life. And I think that some of the stupid plot decisions were just the fact that he ran out of ideas at points. And he's kind of playfully talked about that before too. So not to take any credit away from the stuff that does work, but I think that sometimes we're like, oh, he's a genius, and it's like, no, it's just there's mistakes that happen sometimes in art.
Yeah, I think there's sort of like a weird line between, because again, going back to this idea of like people always jumping to the extremes, or for a perfect example is like the whole like all ours political aspect of it. But another aspect is the this idea of like, should you analyze film? I sort of, I think we've talked about this, where it's sort of like, when it comes to media, quote unquote, media literacy, they always, people kind of always jump to the extremes where it's like, no man, you just don't get it, you're just a pleb, you just don't understand the deeper meaning of this text. And then the other side is like, no, it's not that deep, like you're reading too much into it. um and for me it's like, well, it depends. It really has to, we have to look at, and this kind of is where, on one hand you don't want to do too much research that kind of like takes away the magic of, like, sometimes it's fun to believe that like, oh, this is why they did it, and it's like, oh wow, that, the Godfather 2, the ending was so brilliant, oh, he just didn't show up. um or like, oh, look at that shot, and then you find out, oh, actually it was by accident, they didn't realize that shadow was in the back. um However, then it kind of gets into more like, if we're talking about, character motivation, or if we're talking about, nuance of story that way, where, well, there's clearly something deeper going on. There's clearly things that we can see the writers are trying to imply from textual evidence. But we don't want to go too far and say that, like, oh, I'm watching The Sopranos and Tony's, the color of his shirt is the same as Livia's robe, and it signifies that he's becoming her. It's like, okay, hold on, let's chill out. Like, that's when we're kind of going a little bit too far. But then on the other hand, I'm like, well, we don't want to completely flatten everything to just, there's clearly parallels that we see here, like even bits of dialogue. Then again, you could say it's like, well, maybe all that was just incidental, maybe all that was just accidental. um but that's kind of when you have to, there's a sort of like a weird mix of, if we're talking about, like death of the author, I think on one hand you kind of, you almost kind of have to find a middle ground where it's like, understand that there is intent behind certain decisions, but to not run too wild with them. Where that line is, I'm not really sure. I think it really depends on a case by case basis. But
For me, it's repetition. Like, if you see an element repeated multiple times, then there's probably some meaning
mhm,
behind there. Like the stupid meme from writing classes people always talk about. It's like the blue drapes represent sadness, and they're like, no, the drapes are just blue. Well, if you see blue being used a bunch of
if
different
it's a
times,
motif, yes,
and it's always associated with sadness in some way, then yeah, you can look at that. I agree. An off mention of blue doesn't mean anything per se. And speaking of color in Breaking Bad,
very.
there's this whole thing of people analyzing the color scheme, and it's sort of a half and half because the creators have talked about how every season they would kind of assign a color palette to certain characters or certain scenes or whatever, and it would play out. But the colors themselves weren't chosen specifically for a specific reason, but they were done with intention of like, Walt's gonna be wearing green this season, or
Mhm.
Skylar's gonna be wearing pink or whatever. Like, so it's kind of a mix of both. But
That's kind of where, it comes to sort of like the middle ground where it's like, well, no, this clearly was intentional. Like, that we can clearly see themes in the colors, but we don't want to go too far to say, oh, did you see that Jesse was wearing a green shirt in this scene under his jacket? That means that he's becoming, well. It's like, okay, hold on. Let's, now we're like, okay, we understand the intentionality. We can discuss it. But then once we start kind of like you said, like making these like wild assertions of like, this signifies this, it's like, yeah, we could discuss it. That's interesting. But, there's got to be like a measured discussion when we're talking about assigning intent to the writers.
I mean, at the end of the day, art is in the eye of the beholder, and the meaning you draw. That's where Death of the Author comes in for me. It's like the meaning that you draw from a piece of art is entirely up to you. You'll have a hard time convincing me or other people of some of your more crackpot ideas, but ultimately, I think that like if you draw an interpretation from a work and it's meaningful to you, that's perfectly valid, even if the creator doesn't agree with it or even goes against it in some ways. Like, there's a lot of talk about like authors or creators who like, their political opinions become a source of controversy because maybe there's one group of people that likes the work, and then the creator comes out and believes something they don't like or whatever. And I don't want to get into any specifics, but ultimately you can still enjoy a thing regardless of what the creators behind it intents were. Like, even if you subsequently come to like not like the creators or whatever, like I've got some opinions about David Simon, but I still deeply love The Wire. I deeply love it as a piece of art. And even when the creator, I disagree with them, I don't like them or whatever, you can separate the artist from their work, and I think you should. I think there's a big push about, like, if a creator is, for some reason people don't like them, they want to kind of be like, you can't like this thing anymore. And it's like, no, I think good art stands on its own regardless of, you know, the creator's intentions.
Hmm. But then the other extreme is like people who I see like they're like any deeper look is almost like pseudo intellectual bullshit, and it's like, well, I mean, like again, I think it can really go there, like especially like the curtains are blue, but like you said, it's like it's almost like watching like Blue Velvet, David Lynch, and not, and I'm like, well, clearly like they're doing something with texture and color, and they're like, no, no, bro, you're just being pretentious. And it's like, you know,
I've said
there's
this
sort
before
of,
about David Lynch, but there's some of his stuff that I think is just weird for being weird's sake
oh,
and
absolutely.
doesn't actually have a deeper meaning. But obviously there is intention behind a lot of it.
It's funny, he's one of those, he's a great example of what we're talking about, because there are some things where like whether he's doing it accidentally or like intentionally, some things will be like, this is the most brilliant thing I've ever seen in my life, like it's so perfect in what he's trying to do here and what it signifies. And then the other half is just like, this is the dumbest, most bullshit random thing he just threw in there for fuck's sake. And you'll never know.
There's a joke on The Simpsons that I'm 100% gonna put in my Twin Peaks video whenever I do it, but it's Homer watching an episode of Twin Peaks, and it's like a unicorn dancing with some guy, and Homer is like, oh, very very interesting, very symbolic. I don't get
Yeah,
it.
like I don't know what you're supposed to mean by that. What was? Do you have another example of a piece of meat? Because I have another one that but I it might get us into a deep conversation. Did you have
No,
another one
let's
you
let's
wanted to?
let's do let's get into deep conversation. Like I said, this was inspired by Oz, and I mean, doing research for all these videos, I do generally come away with a greater appreciation because a lot of times, like we talked about before, their ambition a lot of times greater than what's actually on the screen, and so I can appreciate a lot of the behind the scenes stuff, even if it doesn't translate that well. But let's see your let's jump into your interesting topic.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because while I might agree with that in many cases, this particular case I would say almost borderline ruined the movie for me. Where I almost kind of, as much like I can say like, oh yeah, it was a good movie, but like to the point where I almost don't even know if I'd watch it again.
Mm,
Um, so have you seen the Iron Claw?
no,
Well, do you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you. Can
Have
you
you
hear
seen
me?
the Iron Claw?
No, no, I haven't seen it.
Okay. So it is based off of, I'm just getting the details so I don't mess up the names. It's based off the true story of the Von Erich family. They were a very famous wrestling family in the I think the 70s, I believe. Yeah. They were kind of around like when like, Ric Flair and all that was going
Yeah.
on. I'm not really into wrestling, so I didn't know, but so they were a very famous family. I think it was several brothers, I think four in the movie. And basically, it's a story of, I'm going to spoil it for everybody. It is a strong movie, but yeah, I think you'll understand when I get here. So basically, it's a story about how these four brothers were basically like pushed by their father into sort of like following this and making him proud. But it basically led to the destruction of them.
Hmm.
One of the brothers ended up dying from, he was injured during wrestling, like a wrestling move, but he didn't want to tell his father to let him down, and he ended up dying from, I want to say, I think, what was it? Burst intestine in Japan
Oh,
when he traveled there. Very, very tragic. And then later on, the youngest brother, who in the movie, at first he's like not really into wrestling.
yeah.
Um, but he's a musician. He wants to be a musician, but he ends up getting dragged into it by his father. During a wrestling match, he gets, I think, like a dislocated shoulder, and they sent him in for surgery. But during the surgery, something went wrong. I think he developed sepsis, and he ended up being very like he had like I think some physical impairments as a result, and he ended up committing suicide sometime after.
Mm.
And then of the two remaining brothers, uh, the younger brother, I believe, the one who's not played by Zac Efron, um, he ended up winning the title, but eventually the pressure was just so much for him, and the father's abuse was too much that he ended up killing himself too.
Oh.
So yeah, it's incredible. If you didn't, if you bade this spoiler warning, it was a very I did not know this going into the movie. It was very
Yeah.
devastating. True story. But basically, so I'm gonna do a video on it in regard to sort of like how it, celebrates, it critiques toxic masculinity, but also celebrates a sort of brotherly love kind of masculinity. It's a good sort of like, you know, it preaches what, true masculinity is. And Zac Efron was the brother who, defied the father and started a new legacy with his own family and did not
Yeah.
follow in his father's footsteps. Um, and it was a great movie, and we loved it, and it was very affecting. But then on our way home, me and my wife, we discovered something that I really, really did not like. So it turns out that in the film there are four Von Erich brothers: Kevin, Kerry, uh, Mike, and I want to say Dave and David. Kevin, Kerry, David, and Mike. There was a fifth brother named Chris, who was, I think he was the youngest. We found out afterwards that the reason that the writer did not include Chris into the story was not because, sorry, to add context, Chris, the youngest brother, was also a wrestler, and he also ended up killing himself, just like his other three brothers in the film. However, when we discovered that the reason that the writer did not put him in here was, and I quote, um, Chris Von Erich, the youngest member of the family, was not included in the screenplay because, according to Durkin, the writer director, it was one more tragedy that the film couldn't really withstand. I don't. So it's. I don't. So basically, this is a film about this family and sort of like honoring their memory and their legacy. Um, and like sort of like because it's there's a great scene at the end where the brothers sort of reunite in the afterlife. It's kind of nice. It's very touching. It's almost kind of like a tribute to the brothers. Um, However, after we found out that they omitted one completely, um, it kind of put a bad taste in my mouth. It kind of
Hmm.
felt like why did like what like if
Yeah.
this is supposed to be sort of like an honoring of their legacy, you omit a brother completely. Um, I have to look into I think I looked into it, but I forget. I don't think that who is it? Kevin, who Zac Efron plays in the movie. I don't think he was happy about that. I think he was actually very pissed about that. Um, so yeah, while it is sorry that was long. There's a lot of context, but while it was a good movie, while great performances, it was touching. For that reason, I don't know if I'm going to be able to ever enjoy the movie again. Just knowing that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's, you know, it's hard to judge if you haven't seen it, but yeah, I mean, I think there's stuff like that that like you can kind of leave a sour taste in your mouth. I think that a lot of people feel that way about historical stuff, like when they portray people in a not really authentic way. I One example that springs to my I don't know why this one springs to my mind, but Casino, the
That one
movie.
got me too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the way that they portray the wife is like, very 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 much against like who that guy actually was, like very abusive guy. And the movie, really doesn't. I mean, obviously, Casino's not a 100% retelling. It's inspired by the story rather than it's not like Goodfellas. Like the characters are named different stuff. Um, but there's a lot of examples of like where it's like, this feels kind of disrespectful to portray this person in this way. Um, sometimes it can be kind of benign where it's just like, ugh, they just made a story choice. But yeah, I think that when you learn about some of the real life history behind a lot of stuff, it can leave a very sour taste. It can leave you very confused about how to feel about it. I mean, I like Casino still. I still think it's a pretty good film, but yeah, I'm glad that people point out the hypocrisy behind some of this, where it's like, no, this guy. I mean, you could say the same thing almost about Goodfellas. Like it portrays Henry Hill in a much more positive light than he probably deserves. But the film also does call him out a lot too, so it's a little bit more balanced in that regard than Casino is for the lefty character.
Yeah, and granted, you could almost argue that. Well, I guess you could also put this towards Casino, um, where one of the ironies of Goodfellas is that this is actually something that I didn't think was executed as well in Wolf of Wall Street. Was that well, obviously, like, because Henry Hill was the cooperator, he kind of was the one who got to tell his story. He's the one who's telling the story. The film not only does go, show that he was an asshole, that he did awful things and was terrible to his wife and his friends and everything. Um, and particularly at the end when he sells him, when he doesn't do it for some like I wanted to do the right thing. He was like, no, he didn't want to get killed. Um, it also frames it as if and he's an unreliable narrator in a sense. Like for example, that my favorite line of it or that kind of communicates this is the beginning when he's like, "That's all Paulie and the mob does. They just offer protection people who can't go to the cops." And it's like it's almost framing it as if this very naive like like he knows that's bullshit. Like he knows that's not true. So it almost kind of frames it as if it's this like part of it is like, we're taking his shit with a grain of salt. Even at the end when he breaks the fourth wall, it's almost like the film is like, even Scorsese is kind of like,
Well,
okay, good.
there's that weird shot at the end where Joe Pesci's like shooting at the camera,
Hmm.
and I get that it's a reference to the
The
Great
Great
Train
Train
Robbery,
Robbery.
one of the first motion pictures. I still am like, I don't quite get what I mean. I get its reference. I don't quite get the point of putting it in there. It reminds me of something I did in my writing class when I was in college, where I ended my story with a quote from like a famous quote from William Faulkner, and my
Mm.
teacher's like, "It's cool, that quote, but it doesn't really add anything to the story. You're just kind of putting it in there as like you know this quote from this author." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's fair." And I kind of felt that way about the ending. And we should
If
also
any,
point out. I was just gonna say we should also point out that the movie portrays some of the other characters a lot better than they actually are. Like Henry Hill's wife was having an affair with
Polly.
Paulie, and they don't talk about it. Paulie's just portrayed as like this very benign, like you know, father figure to Henry.
Yeah, well, so that's a good example where it's like I think when we're talking about changes being made, we have to go by intent. So, for example, my favorite film is Amadeus, which by all accounts is like almost completely inaccurate. There's no evidence that any of this is
It's very
true.
negative towards Salieri when in reality he had nothing to do with his death.
However, I don't think the film is trying to be put forth as a even when the stage play was put forth, it wasn't trying to be a historical recounting. It was very much like it's being now. Granted, you can say it's like, well, where is the limit to that? It wasn't if it was like this is the true story of the biography of Mozart. It's very tongue in cheek, comedic. Like there's stuff like that. So I think in that case, I'm like, okay, as long as we and granted this, it also is not to say that like this maybe you can't this doesn't really track, but like the fact that we're talking about people who have been dead for like hundreds of years, that's one thing. Whereas with the Casino example, or so far. So for the Goodfellas example, I kind of understand why they took out that aspect of Polly and um her Karen's relationship because one, it's not like the film frames Karen as like, they even go, babe in the woods. It's not like they frame her as if she's like innocent. They also frame her as like, you knew exactly what he was doing. You were just as toxic, you weren't like this innocent. So adding that probably would it have really added much? Um, and also, I think the reason, if I were to say why they would do it, is ironically, to make Henry's betrayal of Polly later in the film to make him seem more hypocritical in the sense that like, hey, he was a guy who was always by your side and stuck by you even when you were terrible to him and was the worst. Um, it's a more from the dramatic. It's a really good dramatic beat without really sacrificing anything in the story. Um, whereas, oh, sorry, go ahead.
The line between like where we draw the line is very fuzzy because I
Mhm.
agree with you. I really like Amadeus, so I think it's a really really good film. I do feel kind of bad for Salieri that like you can say as much as you want, like, hey, this is not real history. It's inspired by history, but it's not the truth. If you ask most people now, granted, a lot of people are not going to know who Salieri or even Mozart is, probably, but
Mhm.
if they do know about it, they probably think that Salieri was this person in the film because the film is so popular that it's completely overshadowed the real history behind the guy. And I kind of feel bad that his legacy is tarnished by this semi fictionalized portrayal. I mean, again, we can say that who cares? He's an ancient figure from 200-300 years ago. Like, what does it matter? But a lot of people got up in arms about the portrayal of God, who was it? Marilyn Monroe. They had like a biopic about her, and they portrayed her as like very crazy and like this tragic figure. When they're like, hey, this woman was an icon. You shouldn't denigrate her like that, and portray her that way. So, and maybe they're just saying that because she's a relatively more modern figure that we still have kind of conscious memory of. But yeah, I don't know where we draw the line. It's a very fuzzy thing that it's like I appreciate great works of art even if they're not 100% accurate, but how do you deal with like honoring someone's memory and like giving like a realistic portrayal of who they are?
Well, I'll get back to Casino in a second, but I think I have not seen the film Blonde because I was excited for it at first and I heard it was shit. I'll eventually get around. I'll eventually get around to it. However, so specifically, what I heard about why there was controversy wasn't so much that it was because I think a lot of people actually appreciated that it really showed just how not glamorous her life was. Like she had a really like the people took advantage of her. It was really fucked up. Um, I think the main issue though, and I think this is where it gets into like, so for example, like you could say, well, did the film probably frame certain people in her life as worse than maybe they were? Maybe, but the general feeling of the film is like we're trying to tell her story, sort of like an almost emotional. We're not trying to be a biography. We're trying to show her, this is how she saw the world. These are the people who took advantage of her, and to her they look monstrous, I guess you could say. So in that case, I'm like, okay, well, that I can kind of get there. I think specifically, I might correct myself for the issue I had with or people had with the film was that it heavily implied that Marilyn deeply regretted never having children or that she couldn't have children, one of those two. Um, even though I don't know if that was ever a thing, or maybe she had an abortion and like the film made it seem as if she like deeply regretted it and she like, whereas I don't think there's any evidence of that. I think that was where they kind of the sort of like disrespectful came in, where you're like, oh, hang on, you're not only are you like maybe like rewriting certain parts or like making someone seem more villainous than they were, even if they were a real villain, you're adding a whole element of this real person that you don't even know was true. Um, Yeah, and particularly because you're sort of it, she's a because like you said, her story is like, oh, she was this glamorous icon, but she's a very big cautionary tale of sort of like being chewed up by the system and just being like being portrayed as like everything's perfect and pretty, whereas everything beneath it's like horrifying.
Well, you could say the
um
same thing about Amadeus. They added this complete thing to Salieri that really wasn't there in real life, and it's like, why is that okay, but why is this other thing not okay? And it's like, it's a very fuzzy line about like,
well
what.
I think the only difference would be that, to your point, I think the difference would be that most people probably never had heard of Salieri before the film. And I actually think, not to like, this doesn't really apply, but I actually think that the film, because of that, people looked into it. And once they realized it was a fake story, or once they learned it was a fake story, then they actually, Salieri probably got more people who like looked into his work. I think he even like, I think the film led to a resurgence of his work, if I'm not mistaken.
Sure, but I
Um,
don't know if you can ascribe the intent to that of like, what if that didn't happen?
yeah,
Again, I'm not
it's
deeply offended by the character assassination of Salieri or anything like that, but I'm just saying that like it is a weird line we draw of like what's okay to change, what's not okay to change. You know,
yeah. Well, I think
it's
it's
not clear.
particularly for Marilyn Monroe. I think it was not because I don't think this makes a difference for ethically, but I think the reason it was so much more of a backlash was because she was such a well-known figure, and because the true story of her life came out, and we knew like people knew just how awful it was, and then they tried to kind of like sanitize or like bring it into the other direction. But that's where it kind of, because like then the question is like, well, why did you add that to the story? I understand why they did it with Amadeus. They're just trying to tell a story, and apparently most of the characters in that narrative weren't anything. Even Mozart, his entire demeanor, they're like, there's actually no real evidence of that. There is like some evidence that like he liked fart jokes, but like his demeanor in the film isn't really, there's really no um, evidence that that is actually how he behaved at all. Um, However, whereas with take something like Casino, that sort of weird with the whole like Ace Rothstein thing, I kind of am like, so like, what is the intention of that? Like, why was that at what? Because like on one hand, I'm like, well, were they trying to make
You just want to be
Ace?
cool. You want to make a cool story.
But what I mean is like, would have added this stuff, would have made, would that have made it a less cool story if they really showed Ace for who he was in terms
Probably
of
because
marriage?
they wanted
Or
him to be a more glamorous figure, like the Henry Hill. They made Henry Hill a lot more glamorous than he probably was in real life, because that's the whole. It's like the glitz and glamour of Vegas at that time, and I think that's what it comes down to a lot of times too. Is like people are very forgiving if what you make at the end of the day is like a really good movie, right? Like we will forgive the inaccuracies, we'll forgive the bad stuff if what you give us is a really cool thing that people like. And when it doesn't turn out good, then people start pointing the finger, and then they start picking it apart and being like, you did this badly, you did this badly, whatever. But at the end of the day, I mean, people talk about this stuff about Goodfellas and Casino, but it's not the main narrative is not what Casino got wrong or what Goodfellas got wrong. It's Goodfellas and Casino are great films that are very entertaining.
well, but again, it's like to go back to the Henry Hill example. While you are correct, while I think that they kind of maybe sanitize how he was, I still think the film makes it clear that like at the end of the film, it's not as if we're like, oh man, Henry, yeah, he was a good guy. Like no, he was like at the very end we understand that like he's Paulie, I won't do drugs. And that cuts to him cheating on his wife and doing drugs. Like it's, and it wasn't trying to make his like, it wasn't trying to frame him as like a poor, victim of the system of drugs. It, like, no, he was, I think the film, while you are correct and that it did glam it up, I think it, you could even say the same about The Sopranos in a way. It still balances it out with enough where we're kind of like, we get this idea that like, it's not like, Scorsese wants us to think that Henry was some like reluctant hero who's had to you know had to put an end to the injustices. Like, no, he was a scumbag like the other scumbags. Maybe he downplayed it a little bit, but I think we could still say he was a scumbag. Whereas with Ace in Casino, I mean, granted, he was working for the mob and he did some like, shifty things, but I would say generally Ace in Casino is much more, I don't want to say likable, less scumbaggy than he probably was in real life. And it isn't really balanced out in the same way that I think Goodfellas is. So the question there would be, did we do this because we kind of wanted Ace to be sort of, compared to like Nikki and all the other characters, was he sort of supposed to be like more like the straight man? Did we kind of want to frame him as more of like an everyman in a way? Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I think they wanted the character to be more likable because it carries the movie more, especially because I mean he lives at the I don't know how much of that is a real thing or not. But given that he's the one who survives to the end, not Nikki or any of the others, I just think I think they wanted to make him a more likable character. And at the end of the day, I mean it's a great entertaining film, and so people will forgive any kind of inaccuracies there.
The only downside is it makes Ginger seem like a fucking. I mean, she probably was crazy in real life, but like that, the film
I
makes it
mean,
out to be
not
almost
nearly to
like.
the extent, and obviously the downplays how much abuse she suffered from. I mean, that's really the problem. It portrays Ace as like he's a very loving husband, and she's like rejecting him for kind of no reason.
Mhm.
Now, I mean, the film does kind of like is upfront that like she never loved him. Like he kind of knew that too. But no, he was a very very abusive to her, and yeah, that kind of yeah, they should have showed more of that, but
Well,
at the end of the day, it is what it is.
and it's funny because it's not like that Scorsese has shied away from this, like in Raging Bull or Goodfellas. But yeah, that was one thing where, for me, it's more. It's not so much that you change this; it's more I don't really understand the intent, or rather, I understood your intent, but it was kind of a weird intent. But then there's something like the Iron Claw, where I'm almost like I don't even understand what like I mean it's a story about four brothers who and three of them like kill themselves. It's like, oh, it's just we couldn't add the fourth because it would have been too sad. It's like, what? Like I don't I really I part of me, the cynical part of me was like, hey, we're not going to give you the money for this movie if it has to be like 2.5 hours, which probably if we add the fifth brother Chris, it would have been that long because you had, or maybe it was for pacing reasons. I don't know.
I mean, yeah, sometimes movies just simplify stuff to just make it easier to tell the story, and it's like, how many extra pages is this character going to add versus? I mean, it's a shitty thing to do, but like movies do that all the time. They cut people, they simplify it down, and again, in this case, I agree with you. It sounds pretty egregious, but plenty of other stories have cut out important characters from the story, and it's like we give them a pass. It's a very thin line where we don't give them a pass at a certain point. So I don't know where that is. It's like a case by case basis.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's kind of like that's sort of the like for example, if I watch a movie and there's a composite character or something. It's like, that's probably, I understand why you would do that. The issue I have with the Iron Claw is like it's framed very much as like sort of like an ode to the brothers. And again, there's a very touching scene at the end where, granted, it takes place in Zac Efron. It's implied to kind of take place in Zac Efron's fantasy where the brothers reunite in sort of like the afterlife. Um, but every time I watch that scene, as beautiful as it is, it's like it's kind of weird that like you're omitting, and not just like if it, not to say it's not like you're omitting like the family was like nine brothers, and it's like, well, we simplify it down to like three or four. Like, okay, but like just this one brother gets it feels very it almost ruins the film for me, where I'm almost like I can appreciate it, but I don't. It's I'd be watching the whole thing with my arms crossed the whole time. I'd be like, damn it.
I feel it, dude. Well, we've hit our hour here. So thank you guys for listening. We've got some some cool stuff coming up here. We got Megalopolis coming out at the end of the month. I bet we'll do an episode about that.
I already bought my tickets.
If it
Let's
turns out
go.
to be a dumpster fire, have you really bought the tickets already?
Oh yeah, at Alamo. Almo's so weird. They sometimes like movies they won't put them up for sale like the day before, and then others it's like 4 weeks ahead. I've already bought my tickets for Joker 2 too.
Okay, cool. Well, we'll have some more stuff coming up for you guys. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode coming soon.
Take care, y'all.